This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado Chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guests today are Nancy Smith and Austin Rempel. Nancy is the Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Program, and Austin is the Riparian Restoration Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy. Both Nancy and Austin are working on the front lines of some of the West's most innovative water and habitat conservation projects that benefit everything from groundwater supplies to wildlife habitat, climate resiliency to ecosystem health. If you've listened to many of these TNC-focused episodes, then you'll know that TNC works extensively throughout the Colorado River Basin on a wide range of conservation issues that affect people, wildlife, and landscapes. In this episode, we're going to zoom in on one very specific, very simple, and very effective process that has the potential to have massive positive impacts on ecosystem health throughout the West. The process is called low-tech process-based restoration, which is the practice of adding simple, low-cost structures made of natural materials to stimulate natural processes like beaver dams and streams and wetlands, kickstarting natural cycles of recovery. These structures require minimal permitting, can be built quickly by hand without heavy equipment, use locally sourced materials, and can be installed by local workers who do not need extensive training. The end result creates surprisingly effective outcomes that can be scaled quickly across vast stretches of the West. We recorded this conversation the day after Colorado River Day, which was a fitting time to highlight such an important project and process. We started out by discussing how this project came to be, which involved a significant amount of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. We talk about how rivers have historically looked in the West versus how they look today, as well as the ecological complexities of riverscapes and riparian corridors. We then dig into the details of low-tech process-based restoration, including timelines, challenges, opportunities, partnerships, and measuring success. We also talk about beavers, shifting cultural norms around conservation, overlaps between forest and riparian restoration, favorite books, and much more. As you'll hear, Nancy and Austin provide such an excellent overview of several varieties of low-tech process-based restoration. But for those of you who want to dig deeper into the details of the various processes and case studies, they've provided me with extensive additional resources that you can access through the episode notes. I'd also encourage you to check out the short film embedded on the episode's webpage, which will give you a visual overview of the process and its results. A big thanks to Nancy and Austin for such a fun conversation, and thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. Well, Nancy and Austin, thank you all so much for joining me. We had to reschedule once, and I appreciate y'all's flexibility, and I loved preparing for this interview as I have with all my TNC interviews. I learned so much, and so selfishly, I enjoy the preparation process. But I was wondering, since we got both of you on the line, if we could start with just intros. And Nancy, maybe we'll start with you. If you could just talk a bit about what you do at TNC and kind of how you ended up doing this work that you do at TNC.
Yeah, thank you, Ed, so much for having us this morning to talk about this topic. So I have been with the Nature Conservancy, it amazes me sometimes, for 25 years. This is my 25-year anniversary.
Wow.
And, started out my career really working at the nexus of doing interesting public-private sector partnerships. Did that for quite a while. had a midlife crisis, went back to law school and got a law degree and an MBA, which I don't recommend for anyone's midlife crisis. Just get the Corvette and have fun. But went back, got a law degree and an MBA, and realized during law school that I really wanted to focus on water resources in the West. Just, water is my passion now, and I've been working on that for the last 12 years or so.
That's great. And Austin, you don't have 25 years under your belt yet, right?
No, I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I've been with TNC for 5 months now, so Nancy laughs at me a lot, but I'm on the upward swing here, and my job is a great one. I'm hoping to steer a cooperative agreement, a partnership between the Bureau of Land Management, the largest Western land agency in the nation, and TNC, and we're both trying to really catalyze low-tech process-based restoration. So we're working in 6 different states, soon to be 7, and trying to develop these showcase projects that show what low-tech process-based restoration in its best form can look like. And I get to work with an amazing team, all people who came on just for this agreement. And we've all had the chance we came on within about a month of each other, and have all been training together, learning this stuff together, getting our first projects going together. So I'm just, more than anything, I'm grateful for this team and the vision behind this agreement.
That's really cool. And we're going to dive into the specifics of all of it. And it's so interesting. But I'd like to kind of zoom out first, and Nancy, maybe get your thoughts on this. But when I think about the Colorado River and Colorado River conservation, just the first thing that always comes to my mind is just the classic scenes of the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, the Green River, Yampa, all these kind of major rivers that we think about when we think about the West that feed into the Colorado. But what I found so interesting about the work y'all are doing is that a lot of this work is not based, for this specific project we're going to be talking about, it's not based on these big rivers, but kind of it's the meadows and the kind of the land and water above those massive rivers, and working to kind of restore those. And so, Nancy, I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about some of the conservation issues that go on in these meadows, whether you're talking about the channelized flow or just the ecosystems that these wet meadows have historically kind of held, and the threats to them.
Yeah, let me actually take it one step back further, because I think you touched on a really important point that people sometimes forget, that river conservation, it's actually conservation of a huge complex network of ecological systems that most visibly you can see in the results of the flowing river. But at the Nature Conservancy and in my career, rivers are really just one part of a really beautiful system. For instance, in the Colorado River Basin, the vast majority of the water, it starts as snow in the forested areas of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. So suddenly you're realizing that our most important natural reservoirs are actually healthy forests. And so suddenly you're thinking about river conservation, but you realize it's also connected to healthy forest conservation. And then you're thinking about these spongy, wet meadow systems up in the high parts of these river systems. So in order to have healthy flowing rivers down in the desert southwest of Utah, you've actually got to be caring about spongy, green, lush, wet meadows where natural functions are happening in a way that's keeping that water held and slowed down high up in the system before it gathers and rushes down. So I know that's a really big picture vision, but that's, I think, what it's going to take for us to turn around the degradation we've been seeing in our big Western rivers, is really remembering they are part of a big complex system, and there are lots of little pieces that we have to care about and fix. And wet meadows are one of those.
And one of the things I loved as I was preparing for this is I felt like your explanation there was perfect, because I was thinking about my interview with Rob Addington, where we talked about forest health, and then with Matt Cahill, where we talked about the sagebrush sea. And you get all these different kind of landscapes that all end up contributing to the health of a river. And so I think it tees us up perfectly for this conversation. Nancy, one more question for you. This whole project that you guys are working on was kind of put into play by the Inflation Reduction Act, which I kind of felt dumb because I just had no idea that the Inflation Reduction Act would fund something like this. And so could you talk a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and how that has led to this agreement you guys have with the BLM to do all this important work?
Yeah, so the connection point, and I think this is a great change we're seeing in how our government thinks about the valuable infrastructure of our country. The Inflation Reduction Act had some elements that were really focused on improving natural infrastructure. So, natural infrastructure, that sounds kind of wonky. What is that? Well, we've got our hard infrastructure in our cities, our highways, our, sewage systems, our bridges, et cetera, so important. But a great thing that's happening is people are starting to realize that the health of our natural systems, that's like natural infrastructure that keeps our cities and our country functioning just as much as our hard infrastructure. So that is the connection. And that is where a lot of this money came through, is this desire to protect, improve, conserve the natural infrastructure of the country.
And can you talk a bit about the amount of money? So the Inflation Reduction Act gave an amount of money to the BLM. This is my interpretation. Tell me if I'm wrong. And then TNC has engaged in a partnership with the BLM to move forward. And can you just talk about how much money it was and kind of just a summary before we dive into what we're actually doing?
Yeah, the BLM definitely got a nice chunk of money and decided, because they understood the value of this kind of work. And also they understood people forget that the BLM is it is the primary landowner, federal landowner in the Western United States. So they're integral to making sure that the West stays as beautiful and wonderful as it is, and that they knew that they needed to make some investments in the landscapes that they manage and care for. And they got really excited about this particular kind of work, and they wanted to make bigger investments in their riverscapes. So they actually did a couple large awards. We have a cooperative agreement with them for $10 million. And then they did a similar agreement with our good friends over at Trout Unlimited. The idea being that, we could work together and kind of play off each other's strengths. Yep. So we've got a $10 million agreement that's going to last for 5 years. And we're doing everything we can to spread that across a few landscapes. And Austin's actually going to be able to talk a lot more about that.
And it's no surprise to people who have listened to a lot of these TNC episodes that you guys are a great partner with other organizations. And that does seem like the Trout Unlimited thing seems like a perfect kind of meshing of strengths. Austin, you're the on the ground guy. You're making this work happen. I mean, you've spent most of your career in restoration of one kind or another. Can you explain to us the very fancy sounding low tech process based restoration? What does that mean for somebody like me? And I heard in a movie, one time the guy said, explain it as you would to a small child or a golden retriever.
Okay, golden retriever. Honestly, we've been laughing about this week because when you ask anyone in this field what is low-tech process-based restoration, they get kind of a faraway look in their eye and they get really philosophical. So this is a problem for the industry. But trying to boil it down, because there's many different definitions, trying to boil it down, I'd say my definition is these nudges that enable a riverscape or a river. I'll define that riverscape versus river view in a second. But these nudges that we can take to give a river the ability to use its own natural processes to do restoration work, put the river in a place where it can start to use its own process to restore itself. And so I think if you ask this you're going to get a bunch of different definitions. If you ask different people, I think one common definition is going to be using beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures to restore streams. That's true, but it's only a flavor of process-based restoration. And that's kind of the most popular one right now. And I suppose we can get into those structures, but it's really this broader outlook of how do we enable a river to restore itself after some historical degradation. And I think when you're going to get if you want an explanation that's going to get the scientists nodding along, it's when you have sort of taken a look at what is the base impairment? Why is this river messed up in the first place? And be looking to fix that. Because I think one of the things that they're worried about as, large NGOs and get involved in this work, and as more people start to get into this work, is that we're going to go to streams that have watershed impairments, have some sort of larger issue, and start putting in structures and then be confused why it didn't work in the first place. And really it's this idea that, say there's historic mining or logging or overgrazing that made this watershed completely impaired. Our structures, putting a few logs and sticks into the stream, isn't going to cut it. We need to think larger and at a watershed scale.
When you back up a bit and think about it kind of from a historical perspective, I think nowadays when people think about like looking down at a river valley or where there's a stream, they think about this kind of meandering stream that goes through perfectly channeled through the meadow, maybe with green grass on the sides. But that's not necessarily how it was, say, 500 years ago. This kind of ideal, like an ideal trout fishery, may not line up perfectly with what that meadow would have been before European settlement. And so could you talk about kind of historically what meadows in the West have kind of looked like and felt like and versus what they are today?
Absolutely. So this was one of the things I was going to ask, the readers to key into is we need to look at riverscapes differently. We need to not just look at the river channel. We're used to looking at a stream and seeing this little blue line, and that is the river. We need to actually look broader at the upland. So the floodplain, the trees growing around it, that is a part of the river. And that's this riverscape idea, this kind of scene around the rivers. So I think if we went back to before Europeans came and started doing things to rivers, a lot of these streams would have been really messy looking. That is actually one of the first restoration principles we work with, is it's okay to be messy. Natural streams, healthy streams are extremely messy. There's all sorts of trees laying down in them. There's mud everywhere. There's vegetation in the middle. I think if we went back and looked at these healthy streams, it would look more like a marsh. We may be challenged to actually see flow through it because there's just so many little streams going left and right and little pieces of habitat here and there. So I think it's the single channel view that we have. If you ask a child to draw a river, they're going to draw a little blue line. It's actually this kind of blue line, a bunch of blue lines with green squiggles around it and much, much wider. And that's one of the things we're working on, is just how do we impart to this larger riverscapes view versus just a river.
And I might, the elephant in the room, or the beaver in the room, is that a lot of that was, and people don't think about this, that the Western landscape, those river systems, those riverscapes, were dominated by beaver. The beaver population was estimated, I got this from a National Park Service source, to be 100 to 200 million individuals. And then during the fur trade, which was, late 1600s, late 1800s, the beaver population plunged, and we're just now getting back to a population of about 15 million. So, 15 million, it's less than 10% of what might have been the historic population. And that's a really, really critical factor and reason that we're so interested in this type of low-tech process-based work, because our Western rivers are facing enormous challenges due to climate change and, reductions in flow. I'm sure your listeners have heard before that since 2000, flows in the Colorado River Basin have decreased by 20%. And that's like enough water for 14 million households per year. So it's a lot of water. And at least half of that reduction can be very clearly linked back to temperature increases due to climate change. So climate change is a current threat that's really hammering Western hydrology, on top of the fact that our rivers were already enormously challenged because of the extirpation of beaver. So, people think, gosh, we've really got to make these new investments in increasing the resilience of our watersheds because of climate change. And that's 100% true. But that urgency is even further exacerbated by the fact that we were already starting from a deficit. We were already starting from a situation where rivers have been really hammered due to eliminating beaver.
That's a great point. That's, when I love history and I read a ton of history, and you just think about, when I think about the West and the history of the extraction of resources, that beaver trade was obviously the number one thing, and they really did clean them out. And I don't know, it's interesting when you're sometimes, one thing I do want to talk about in a few minutes is kind of the cultural things about beavers, and because I think a lot of people don't want them around, whether it's they're clogging up their irrigation ditches or they see them as a pest. And so we don't need to talk about that now, but at some point I'd love to hear how you kind of overcome some of the cultural pushback to having beavers on properties. But before that, Austin, could you describe, you talked about it a bit, but could you describe in more detail these actual structures? So you'll go, and there's a great video that you sent me of some of this work being done up in Montana, and I'll have that on the webpage, and I'll link to it so people can go and watch. But can you do your best to kind of describe what these structures are and how you go about installing them in these areas? Because in my old life, I was in the real estate business selling ranches, and I was always real nervous when anybody got close to creeks or waterways on their ranches, because I felt like, you don't want to be having any violations or having to bring in the Army Corps engineers or anything like this. It can get real complicated real quickly, but that's kind of the exact opposite end of the spectrum of what y'all are doing, if I understand it correctly.
It is, but Army Corps is big on our mind. So I think I'll describe the structures, and then we can get into the permitting ecosystem, because that has honestly been the biggest surprise to me, is just how large permits loom in this space. But backing up, low-tech process-based restoration involves many different kinds of structures. The highest profile ones are these beaver dam analogs, and that's, you're going to hear the acronym BDAs. And those are just basically human-built beaver dams. We're doing our very best to mimic how beavers build dams. And one of the artistic points of this kind of job is all the little things that beavers do to build their dams a certain way. Once you start to look at how they do it, they're just geniuses. Where they build, how they impound water, or detain water. It's genius. So we have that, and then there's the sister structure is post-assisted log structure, or PALS. And so let me describe those two. So a beaver dam analog, most of the time it uses posts. So to have it not wash away, because water has a lot of weight behind it. So once you start to pool things, it really wants to wash everything down. I was just building these 2 weekends ago, and we had a couple wash out and erase hours of work. So the posts are important because it locks everything in place for a little bit. And they're biodegradable, untreated, and you're not expecting them to be there for more than a year or two. And if you have a flood, they're probably gone next year. But in that time, they will have done their work. So we use posts to kind of build a stream spanning structure, and then we sort of pack mud and rocks down at the bottom to make this nice foundation. And that's learning from how beavers do it. They have this nice sort of pad at the bottom, and then you start packing willow on. And one of the nice things that beaver do is they put sticks perpendicular, so going down the stream, and that makes kind of a mattress, and that softens the water as it goes over the dam and doesn't scour out beneath it. And so we're basically trying to build a beaver dam using these posts as anchors. And then the other kind of structure you're going to hear a lot about is post-assisted log structure. And that's something that doesn't pond water as much. Beaver dams really pond water behind them because they have this mud and sticks and stuff backing up the water so that beaver can have this pond that keeps them safe. These log structures are more like log jams, really, constructed log jams. And so they're nice because they don't have pooling. When you don't want pooling, they're what you should get. And they also just kind of make the river snake around. That's one of the things, the healthy principles of rivers. When you're looking for healthy signs of a stream, it changes every year. You don't want a stream to look the same every year. If you go back and, Google Mississippi time lapse, the Mississippi is snaking around over the past 100 years. It's snaking around, changing every year and year. That is what a healthy river looks like. And so these post-assisted log structures, they can slow water down and send it to the right, so to the left, just give water more time to be in this system and change the river versus just going straight down the stream, being out of this little parcel in 5 minutes. That's what we don't want. We use a term called bowling alley streams for these streams that are straight, and they scour it's usually big rocks at the bottom. It's scoured. It's, the water is going extremely fast. That is what we want to avoid, because the water is just it's like a ditch. It's going downstream as fast as possible. It's not sticking around and growing fish and trees and holding sediment and all of that stuff. So we want to slow it down. That is one of our principles, is slowing the water down.
When I hear you describe that, I think about, this was probably 10 or 12 years ago now, but back when I was in the real estate business, there was a property that I was working on in South Park, Colorado, so like kind of near Fairplay. And there was this creek that went through it called Trout Creek. And when it got on this ranch, it was as straight as an arrow, because maybe 70 years ago, somebody went in there, I guess for mining operations or whatever, and just completely straightened it out. But then if you went up into the adjoining national forest at probably close to 11,000 feet, it was that marshy, the same creek, just right over the private property boundary. And all of a sudden it was a marsh with tons of beaver dams and tons of trout. And it was just this completely different ecosystem, literally like 10 feet away on the other side of the fence. And so I'd kind of forgotten about that until you mentioned it, but it was kind of the two extremes that I was able to see. One more question before we talk about permitting. When you're doing these projects, what land, like what kind of land are you targeting? Does it have to be on BLM land? Is it private property? Could it be Forest Service? Like what are the landscapes that you're focused on?
Oh, this is a good one. This is basically what we spent the past 6 months thinking about. Because one of the things that scientists are very anxious about in this space is over-application. We get excited about solutions to climate change. We get excited about ways to restore nature. And they're worried that we're going to over-apply this technique, because really it's only going to work in a small subset of streams across the West. We're still talking hundreds of thousands of miles across the West that could be restored through these techniques, but it's not every neighborhood stream. So we are looking for places that are going to really have quick uplift and be just kind of these unicorn streams that are perfect examples of low tech done right. So we have actually 7 criteria, and I'll try not to make this boring, 7 criteria that we are using to filter our landscapes. We are across the West. We're in Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. And we're working across, basically a fourth of a state in each place. So these massive, massive restoration landscapes. And we're looking out across these big areas, looking for streams with specific criteria. And those are basically streams where BLM has enough land base to make a difference. You're not going to see much uplift if you're only working on a half mile. We're looking for those stretches that have, maybe 3 to 10 miles or more, so we can really, really make a difference. Honestly, a lot of the time we're looking for places that have beaver or have the ability to have beaver and riparian vegetation, because we don't want our work to be dependent on human maintenance forever. And that's a big one. Because if beaver can take over our structures, then they're doing work that, we don't have to do. They're maintaining our structures. They're adding new ones. But there's one of our central tensions is we want to work a lot of places, and we have ideas for a lot of places that beaver might not come back. So this has been a tension about can we be successful without beaver? And I think we can, but that is one of the things we're looking for, beaver to take over the work so that they, because they work at nights, we don't. Rate of recovery, we have 5 years to do this. And I think many would argue that you can't restore anything in 5 years. It's kind of a measure of effort if we're trying to do 150 miles. So we want to be able to show people in 5 years, here was this Inflation Reduction Act money. Here's what we did. And we want it to be night and day, just a before and after photo. So we are looking for a very specific stream that is probably in good enough condition to come back immediately. So that's probably looking for the top 1% here of places that can come back that quickly.
And how ideally, like how many years would it take, to be able to see a difference? I would think maybe, 2 years, if assuming the beaver came back and got to work. How long would it take you, like in a good, not best case scenario, but like a good scenario, how long would it take for there to be noticeable recovery?
I hate this answer when I get it, but it does depend. So, the best case,
I should learn to quit asking scientists to nail down things.
Well, but just generally speaking, it does take a few years, and that's the problem. People want to go in and see it the day afterwards. And you can see this with ponding, but really for the river to resuscitate itself and start acting like a normal river, busting its banks, going into floodplains, growing more trees, beaver coming back, 5 years is really the minimum. We kind of struggle with this one and done perspective when really we're going to have to go back and probably see how the first structures went, repair them, add more. And yeah, so it's multiple years at least, and probably more like 5 to 10 years to be a completely different stream, if we're being honest.
And one thing that when Austin was given that great rundown of the things that you start to see change with these over that period of 5 years, and your great story about the comparison on the land you were on, a couple of things that didn't come up that I really want to mention is what's happening underground. So you're seeing all that great, more greenery, more meandering stream, more wetland, more forage for cattle if there are grazers, more forage for the native grazers. But underneath the ground, what you're getting is more aquifer recharge, which is such a critical part of this and so critical to helping our western rivers hold water later in the season. So that's another really important part you're seeing. And then something we haven't talked about is you're also seeing the development of a wildfire break. And in this climate change future, more and more wildfire is a huge challenge we're all going to be dealing with. We've just been dealing in Colorado with smoke down from Canada. And we're finding that landowners, agencies, other people are getting really excited about this kind of wet meadow restoration because it does offer some natural wildfire breaks. We saw that happen up in the Cameron Peak, East Troublesome Creek fire, etc. So I just wanted to add in those other benefits we're seeing. And it really connects back to your first question, Ed, about why the heck did the government use IRA money for this? And part of it is because you can really see it's in a long-term investment in what these healthy wetlands, the kinds of services they provide to our communities beyond what they're doing for wildlife. And I'll just say that worldwide, scientists have estimated that the ecosystem services provided by healthy wetlands is estimated at about 6.5 trillion per year. And of course, that's worldwide, but people forget that healthy wetlands, they help us as well. And the planet has lost almost 70% of its inland wetlands, during the 20th and 21st century. So this is something that needs investment and certainly was a great investment from the government in the IRA Act.
Nancy, another question for you. This is obviously money coming from the government, and I would imagine that they have expectations, that were, you guys put out certain goals that you hope to achieve in this 5-year period, even though that is, you're going to be hustling to during that whole 5-year period. But how do you measure success, either whether it's reporting back to the funder or internally at TNC? Like, what are you, when we get to 2029 and you look back, what will have made this a success for you?
I'm only laughing because measuring success is such a complex thing. Because of course there's the measuring the on-ground success. Mm-hmm. Did the particular action we take on the ground start to produce the sorts of changes in river behavior and the increased vegetation, et cetera, that we hoped for? And totally important. TNC is super committed to science. Of course, so is the BLM and Trout Unlimited. So we do have a really robust science effort that we're working on to monitor that kind of on-the-ground success. That's part of our commitment in general as an organization. But, success goes so far beyond that. You mentioned in passing that you wanted to talk some about the cultural aspects of this. Success is also measured by how are people thinking about what a healthy landscape should look like? How are folks who graze on BLM lands thinking about what a healthy riverscape looks like versus how they might have thought about it in the past? Are we helping people to see through different eyes and realize that sort of messy landscape that Austin described, that how things might have looked when there were more beaver on the landscape, that actually is healthy. That isn't, an underutilized unhealthy landscape. So that's another measure of success. And then really part of success, also we measure success by how much is our state and federal government agencies continuing to invest in this kind of work and sticking it out for the long haul so that we really can make the kinds of investments we have to make to be positioned to weather climate change and to adapt to this permanently hotter and drier future that we're going to be facing in a way that's resilient and where people and nature are both going to be able to thrive.
That's great. Yeah. And then when, the way you so eloquently described the fire aspect, some of these things you wouldn't know. I mean, it could be 20 years from now when a big fire rips through long after the grant has been fulfilled. And then all of a sudden this massive part of the landscape has been preserved because of the wetlands, and we would have never, that's a measurement of success, but it long after the kind of the window of measurement. So it is super complicated. But I feel like TNC, you guys just, of every organization I've ever worked with, you guys kind of meld the scientific, the quantitative, the data with the relationships and the people and the things that you really cannot measure. It's very hard to measure. I feel like y'all just do such a perfect job of balancing that. And I can only imagine how challenging that must be.
Yeah, a lot of these actions, me and my colleagues joke all the time that conserving and restoring our rivers and our lands in the West, it's really not a technical problem. The scientists know what we need to do. It's really a cultural problem. It's a cultural challenge. And so the Nature Conservancy, we're super committed to that. For any of this to work, it has to work for people too. Our human communities and our natural communities have to thrive together.
And so speaking of the communities on the ground where these projects are happening, one of the things that I found was very interesting as I was reading up on this was because there's very little permitting needed, there's an opportunity to engage kind of a wide spectrum of people, whether it could be like youth corps type groups or volunteers, or the installing of these LTPBRs can be done by a wide group of people beyond, heavy equipment operators that need special permitting and all that very expensive kind of things. And so, Austin, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the simplistic nature of these things and how that allows a big workforce to be able to put in a lot of them relatively quickly and relatively cheaply.
Yeah, that is the promise, that you don't need an engineer and you don't need like a backhoe or Tonka toys, as we call them, to do the work. It's much more democratic. It's, my dad, who's, pushing on 80, and I were able to put in a couple of these on our land on 4th of July. We couldn't do that with any other kind of stream restoration. So yes, that is the idea. It's much more democratic. It can involve a lot more people, normal people, doing this work. And building the workforce is one of the challenges. There are not many people who know how to do this work right now because they're just, they haven't been attracted to it. And we're working in very, very rural places. So it's kind of a tall order to get a crew of 12 people out to put in several hundred of these structures in the middle of nowhere, frankly. So one of our measures of success. So when we're in 5 years, if we have a workforce that's mobilized around this, we have professional crews that are willing and able to do this year round. They can have houses, good jobs, live where they want to, and have full-time work in restoration, maybe fighting fires in the summer, installing these things in the fall, planting trees in the spring, really this restoration workforce that's there. So we don't have to kind of scramble for labor, because that's where we're at right now. We have to book youth corps because everyone wants to work with youth corps, and there just aren't that many of them. So we're honestly booking 2 years out in some cases. We're talking crews availability 2 years out, which is that's a challenge. So we want there to be more of a professional workforce. So we're really investing in training people, putting tools in their hands. And I'm glad that science came up, because that's been one of the most striking things in this industry for me is the science behind it. There's been a group of folks working on this for about a decade at Utah State University particularly, and they have been developing these online mapping tools that just put the knowledge that's usually in a hydrologist's head in the hands of common people. You can just log in and find pretty much all the data you need to make rational decisions about stream restoration. is this going to work for low tech? And if so, what should I do? And I worked in a few different restoration industries, and this is very different, where there's nothing paywalled. They've just tried to make these tools, make them easy to use, and put them in the hands of others. And we're kind of sailing on that at the moment. BLM is actually, there's kind of a third agreement. There's the TNC agreement, TU agreement, or Trout Unlimited agreement, and then there's a third one with Utah State, just to develop these sort of broad-based science tools to empower everyone. And that's just been a luxury. We've spent a lot of time over the past 6 months learning these tools, and that's the best part of my job, is sailing around in landscapes I've never been to, looking at how these streams are functioning and what we can potentially do for restoration.
This is a question for both of you. Austin, maybe you go first. You mentioned the workforce is a challenge, but when you think about when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're worried about work, if you do that, I do that a lot. Like, what are the challenges, the main challenges that you think about that could make or break this project? I mean, it seems like, in theory, it's it's a simple process, but there are all these very complex forces at play that to make this happen. And so, like, what are some of the main challenges you think about?
Yeah, so I'd say there's two, and I'm going to focus on one. A big one is just the hype versus reality. We are trying to ground this hype, make people excited, show what's possible, but I do worry that the expectations are just too high. And I come from the tree planting space, where we spent maybe the past 5 years arguing about what's possible and if it's possible, rather than just getting to work. So I worry that we're going to get into kind of a cycle like that as hype around this grows. But really, lately, what's been keeping me up at night is just the permitting system. So we have, basically whenever we set foot in the stream, you mentioned this earlier, there are federal and state agencies sort of looking to make sure we're not damaging the water, which is great. But it's been surprising to the extent that we apply laws that were made for hard infrastructure, like putting in bridges, putting in roads around streams. We apply that same structure to natural restoration. So we are trying to restore streams, create wetlands. And instead of getting questions about, like, are you going to damage the wetlands, and sort of acting like putting sticks and stones in streams that are probably going to wash away in a couple of years is similar to bridge building. So we just have a kind of a mountain of paperwork and my main anxiety is this mountain of paperwork deters many projects from getting going. So, you have a rancher who's interested in restoring their stream. If you tell them you have to interact with the government in a pretty sustained way over 5 or 6 months, they're probably not going to do it, or they're just going to do it without permission. That doesn't feel right, this permitting system. But I'll also acknowledge that we need to defend rivers. We need to have this risk-based system, and we need to have someone approving it that says this is okay or this is not okay, and here's how you should modify it. So still coming to terms with this, but we are spending an awful lot of time on permitting for something that, maybe doesn't need a permit.
Sure. Nancy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, what keeps me up at night, Ed, is, it comes back to the first thing Austin said about, some of the science is very early stage in this, and there's a lot to still be learned. And, will the promise of this kind of work live up to what we hope can achieve? That keeps me up. And it keeps me up because of the real thing that keeps me up, which is just that change is happening fast in the West. Climate change is hitting the Colorado River Basin harder than any other area, really, I'd say, in the lower 48. And sometimes I worry, are we going to be able to find the things that we need to do and generate the political will to do them quick enough to be ready for when things really, really change due to climate change?
I'll tell you that in my experience, when I was in the conservation world, I found it could be hard sometimes to convince funders of doing something that wasn't a sure shot, a sure thing. Like we're going to make this happen. And that's one of the things I've admired about so many of these TNC conversations, is that TNC is willing to do things at a big scale for the first time, and it's not always guaranteed. But somebody has to do that, or else there's never going to be any innovation. And I feel like, once again, y'all straddle this line of being responsible stewards of funding while also pushing it just a little bit to test out new ideas. And sometimes they might work, sometimes they might work, but it allows things to move forward. And I feel like that's that's just a very important role for people to play that it can be hard to play. Am I off on that? Do y'all agree with that?
100%. And the thing I would add is, to be innovative, you've got to be willing to test things. You've got to take a phrase from the entrepreneur community, you've got to be willing to fail fast and fail forward. And part of why I've stuck around with TNC for 25 years is because the organization remains committed to that while staying committed to being science-based and also really staying committed to doing conservation in an equitable way, working with people and communities in an equitable way. And part of why we do that is what you said, because that's what it takes to innovate, to take those risks. But also part of why we do it is because we have learned again and again and again over the decades that the best solutions are those that come from the ground up, that come from experience, that come from working with the people who are on the land, that have been stewarding the land for a long time. And I point that out because I was on a tour yesterday of our historic Carpenter Ranch here in the Yampa Valley with some state officials. And, politics in the Colorado River Basin right now are really complicated and very tense. And I was trying to remind them that to keep coming back to the ground and talking to the people on the ground who are trying solutions, who have to live with the government decisions that they make every day. And that is another reason that we really are willing to take risks and try things out on the ground, is because those are the most durable solutions and the ones that work the best.
I love that. Austin, you mentioned this a second ago, but the vast majority of your career has been in the forest restoration world. Now you've moved over to this other side of restoration in the West. And I know you're 5-6 months in, but any kind of big revelations, any thoughts on how either those two sides of the restoration business kind of meld together or how they may be different? I mean, you mentioned some of the technology, but I'd love just to get some of your reflections on any commonalities or differences between those two worlds.
Very good question. So we have a lot of the same challenges. One that takes a lot for people to understand is that nature-based solutions quite often take more time than we'd like them to. So something we constantly struggle with in the tree planting space is we want them to sequester carbon tomorrow, but really it takes 30 years for a tree to grow after you put it in the ground. And a lot of them in the West are probably going to burn before then. So it's hard to talk about outcomes. We need to be working at a much larger scale to see anything like that. So, and we're also not that great at planting natural looking forests. We're good at creating plantations, but we're not great at creating forests that function anything like natural forests. So those are the kinds of things we struggle with, and the reality behind a lot of I think we all know the news stories where, tree planting can help us take carbon out of the air at amazing scales. That's true, but there's all sorts of devils in the details. And it's been frustrating to see that how we spend a lot of time talking about if it's actually a great solution, yada, yada, when there's just so many acres of no regrets activity we could be doing rather than arguing about it. So I was drawn to this work because of the potential for really quick return. And we're still talking, like we talked about, a couple of years minimum, and more like 5 to 10 years to see a completely different stream in front of you. But I really like this idea of being able to put in structures and see immediate gratification. You'll see immediate ponding and maybe have a beaver adopted, which is what happened on my family's place. And that's kind of when I drank the Kool-Aid on this. It was during the pandemic. We were putting in these structures just because I'd worked with the Nature Conservancy before for a summer. In retrospect, I kind of peaked. That was my best job, getting to hang out at a TNC ranch all summer and sort of plan these structures. But
all downhill from there.
Yeah, no, actually. So I got exposed to this work then, and during the pandemic, I started putting these structures into my family's place, and we hadn't seen trout in probably 5 or 10 years. And that second year after we put these structures in, the first trout I'd seen in that time was sitting right below one of these fake beaver dams that we'd built, and they weren't even good ones. And in retrospect, I realized that was a unique case. This was a strain that was really ready to be recovered. We weren't that far gone, all sorts of things that made it kind of one of these unicorn cases. But that is when I thought this should be applied in a lot more places. And so that potential to see immediate results was what really attracted me to this work, and the fact that it's more democratic. It can just be you and your dad putting these things in. Scientists will caution us that's not what they want to see. They're what wakes them up at night is that very idea, is sort of, mom and pop projects that aren't hitting these scientific requirements. And there are a lot. We talk a lot about this being low tech. We still need project managers. We still need trained engineers, because you can do this wrong. And that is what people are scared of, is when we do this wrong, maybe it does lead to a reduction in stream flow downstream, which has happened. Temporary scale, but has happened. We're worried about those bad cases kind of taking over the narrative.
That makes perfect sense. Nancy, you can kind of embarrass Austin here, but you got this big amount of money that came in, and you had to scale up very quickly and bring in people like Austin and for this big effort, 5-year push. I'm curious specifically, like in your mind, what made up a great candidate to be on this team? Because I think a question I get a lot, which I'm very unqualified to answer, is I want to get a job in the conservation world. How do I do it? And I imagine people listening to this think this is really cool, and they're like, "Oh man, I'd love to get a job like that." So I'd be curious, kind of what type of personality traits, technical skills that you were looking for as this team came into place, and then just kind of more broadly, what you look for in your colleagues and potential hires at TNC.
Yeah. First of all, just a word out to any listeners who are contemplating a conservation career, go for it.
I agree. Go.
We need more and more people who care about this work and are passionate about it. In our particular instance, oh my gosh, we lucked out so much with Austin. He's a great micro example of what happens in the macro. Looking at a great mix of what's your past experience. It takes all types of genius and intelligence to make conservation work. And, there are entry points through a really technical science-based background. There are entry points like mine was, I'm a lawyer. There's so many lawyers working on water issues, you wouldn't believe it. We need people who are good with people. We need social scientists. Austin just had that perfect mix of, he had some on-the-ground experience, not only with restoration activities in the forest space, but with building coalitions, with building communities of practice who could come together and leverage each other's strengths. And that would be a word to anyone contemplating coming into conservation. Don't underestimate the importance of the people skills. We're going to make a difference for the future, not just through great science, although that's a really important part of it. We're going to make a difference for the future by being able to build communities and inspire people. So it's important to be able to inspire people. And Austin has that in spades.
I'm squirming right now.
This is the time to ask for a raise, Austin.
I just got here. But could I also talk about the people around?
I'll be your agent.
Team?
Do I get a cut? I can get a cut if you get a raise.
Yeah. Clearly, we're hiring for ability to talk on podcasts, but can I also talk about the team around me? Because there's this phrase at TNC. I think I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, come for the job, stay for the people, something like that. And so far, even though I've only been on for 5 months, that is absolutely true. Because the other 6 folks on this immediate team that are working on this agreement, that we all came around, we came on within a month of each other. And the stories of each of these individuals and why they were attracted to this work and this agreement, each one is completely inspiring. We have someone whose grandfather was a fish biologist for the Bureau of Land Management in her very rural area. She's sort of picking up his mantle, but doing it working for TNC on this cooperative agreement. There's this legacy that I find inspiring, that she just graduated with a fish biology degree. Her grandfather is a fish biologist, and she's doing this work with some of the rarest fish in the West. Lahont and cutthroat are only on a couple streams in Oregon, and we're potentially going to be doing work on those streams to benefit those. And there's 5 other examples like that. There's someone who is basically extending their career, has had an illustrious career in like 2 other areas, wildlife biology, leading collaborative conservation. She was so inspired by the potential of this agreement and this work she's seen, low-tech work in her landscape. She was so inspired by those examples that she saw this and said, like, okay, I need to switch careers. I need to go and join this team and make this land in my home landscape. Again, 4 more examples. This is why I kind of wake up jazzed every morning, because I get to work with these people and see these different flavors of low-tech work. That's what encourages me, and I did not expect it to come from that source, but there you go.
That's great. And the thing is, though, from all the conversations I've had, and then all the work I'd done with TNC, both when I was in the conservation world and when I was in the real estate world, I mean, that's been my impression is the people. I mean, the work is obviously so important, but everybody I've ever dealt with at TNC is like, I want to be their pal outside of work as well. So it's a good deal y'all have going, and it doesn't just happen. That is a very intentional thing that's been developed over many, many decades. So congrats on that. You guys could teach a class at business school on the hiring people. For people who listen to this podcast all the time, they know I'm kind of obsessed with books. And I love books about conservation. I love books about the West, but then I love books on like the most random subjects you could ever imagine. And so I'd love to hear from y'all some of the books that have either been important just in your life, just making you become the people that you are, or some that may even be related to this specific work that you're doing right now. Nancy, maybe I'll start with you.
So I'm gonna do something slightly iconoclastic for my first quote unquote book. First thing I'm going to say is, I really feel like the best book I want to recommend to people is no book. I just feel like people need time to just go out and sit and be in nature. And, we have so much content, we have so much information coming at us. And I really sometimes just see the best things come out in people when they just put it all down and they just go out and they sit in, be part of nature. So that's a little bit of a trick question, but there you go. But I
love it, and I agree with that.
Yeah, for a real book, I would say absolutely read The Emerald Mile. It's the story about the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon in the 80s, and it is just a riveting, great, fun read that also gives you a lot of background into the really complex and interesting water issues up the Colorado River Basin.
That's a great one. I was actually just emailing with Kevin earlier this week, and he's going to be coming on to talk about his newest book as well, because Emerald Mile is such a cult classic, and then his newest book has been doing so well. So he's a hero of mine. So I'm going to be excited to have him on here. So people who like the Emerald Mile, tune into that. Austin, you got any books?
Yeah, I do like the appearance of an anti-reading message. I didn't expect that. The one that came to mind is a book I read a while ago, and I've just been kind of dredging it up from my memory quite a bit lately in this work, but it's Water, A Natural History by Alice Outwater. So it's a book about water by a person named Alice Outwater, but it's the thing I've been thinking about lately is her central premise is that we used to have a lot of mammals on this continent that really controlled hydrology. So bison, prairie dogs, and beavers. Bison used to create these little biodiversity hotspots in their wallows. They'd go and find muddy spots and, roll around, and those become kind of pothole streams in the prairies. And there's all sorts of unique animals and life around those. And, multiply that by millions of beings, and you're getting a completely different ecosystem. Then you have prairie dogs that had these west-wide towns, and they have holes, and that was helping rainwater infiltrate into the soil and get down into the aquifer more quickly, rather than just running off and taking all the soil with it. And then last, and certainly not least, you had beavers that were in, the majority of stream miles. I think Nancy said earlier that we're dealing with less than 10% of the beavers we once had. And lately we've been spending a lot of time reconning streams, and we're up in what feels like a completely dry desert landscape. And we'll go up on these hills and we'll find old beaver chews in a place where there's no trees. So it's hard to imagine what we've lost. There used to be so many more flowing water streams and marshes in places that are just unthinkable now. So I guess I've been thinking a lot about this legacy of all these animals that we've lost and what they used to do for the hydrology and how different it looks. It's a good book. I've never
even heard of that book, which is embarrassing. So there'll be a link to that. And then I'll throw in, you sent me an excerpt from Eager by Ben Goldfarb, who I need to get on the podcast because his books continue to come up. But I have not read that book, but reading it was maybe like a chapter of it, really interesting and fits perfectly with everything we've been talking about today. I really need to read that book. Last question for you both. Nancy, I'll start with you. Any parting words of wisdom for all the listeners? Everybody who listens to this podcast, at their core, they just love the American West. And there's a big conservation ethic through a lot of the listeners. And so any parting words of wisdom, anything you want to share to wrap it up?
Yeah, I'll say, your listeners, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but my words of wisdom would be don't stop caring and take really good care of yourselves and your care of each other, because it's going to be a long haul to really care for and restore these landscapes that we love in the West. And we got to do it in a joyful, happy way. So get out there, enjoy nature, do it with friends, and lean on each other to really build a better future.
Love it. Austin?
Yeah, that's beautiful, Nancy. Mine would be something I think I've said a couple times on this, is just look at rivers differently. The next river you see, look at it and try to view it differently. Try to view the riverscape around it, maybe the 50 to 100 feet on either side of the river, as part of that river, and stop using the term river and use riverscape. And there's kind of a mental switch that happens. We talk about something called the blue line problem, and that's when we're used to looking at maps and seeing blue lines on a map, and that's also carries over to how we see rivers. And if we're going to restore these rivers, we need to see them differently and be thinking about the watersheds around them and the immediate floodplain. And many times flooding is good, and these things look messy. And yeah, that's been the flip in my mind. And you see such potential with stream restoration when you start to see that it's this broader thing.
Y'all are so cool and fun, and I learned so much. I mean, really, I'm embarrassed, but I really didn't know. I knew almost nothing about this subject, and I feel like I've just taken a college class on it, and my life is better for knowing it. So thank you for the work you're doing, first of all. Thank you for educating my numbskull self who needs all the education I can get. But really, y'all are great. I really, really appreciate you taking the time, and keep up the great work.
Thanks a lot. What a great way to spend a morning.
Yeah, thank you, Ed.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. But thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.